Hello! I think it's long overdue that I look at a high quality California wine. So today I thought I'd taste a bottle of 2014 Ridge, and I'll just have to swing that round there, Lytton Springs. And this is a field blend, predominantly Zinfandel, from Dry Creek in California. And sometimes people will refer to it by the shorthand name of Lytton Springs Zinfandel. Now, Ridge are an iconic California winery that originated in its current form in the early 1960s, when a group of Stanford graduates bought an abandoned and overgrown vineyard on a ridge in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And the idea initially was that this was going to be a mountain holiday retreat for a small group of families. However, they soon saw the potential of what was the Montebello Vineyard to grow fabulous grapes. A vineyard had been planted here before Prohibition, in fact in 1865, and the old winery, entirely processing fruit with gravity, was still in place. The group started to take the venture more seriously, and in 1969 they appointed a winemaker, somebody who went on to become famous for running Ridge, Paul Draper. Under Draper's guidance, the winery very quickly got into its stride, and in fact the 1971 vintage of Ridge features really prominently in Stephen Spurrier's 1975 Judgement of Paris tasting, where it was quite successful. One of Ridge's earliest ventures to expand was to start in 1966 buying Zinfandel fruit from the Geyserville vineyard and making a Zinfandel. In 1972, Paul Draper set off to Sonoma County to look for more fruit for this wine, and a chance meeting with its owner took him to the Lytton Springs vineyard, where he found a site with substantial plantings from the early 1900s. In fact, the oldest block on the eastern side of the vineyard was mostly planted in 1901. Draper bought the fruit, and Ridge had been making a wine from Lytton Springs ever since. For the first 19 years, Ridge leased the vineyard and made the wines. However, in the early 1990s, they were able to acquire the vineyard and the winery. So Lytton Springs is now a wine that's entirely produced on a single estate. Now, Ridge's philosophy for making Zinfandel is to let the grapes express themselves. While many producers will actually work Zinfandel quite hard to try and extract as much flavour, colour and tannin as possible from the variety, Ridge's approach is to treat it very gently with short macerations, and actually they go to the extent of not pumping the fruit anywhere at all, and this stops the skins being churned up. So instead they're fermenting in small vessels, and they'll take the fermenting vessels to the presses and physically empty them in, rather than running the wine through a pump where the skins would get churned up and release harsh tannins. In fact, beyond that, Ridge's entire approach is to intervene as little as they feel necessary in the winemaking process. They make it quite clear they don't use any enzymes to aid extraction. They don't supply fermenting yeast with nutrients during the ferment. And on their labels, they'll voluntarily provide details of all the processes that go on, just to demonstrate how little intervention is necessary to make a fine wine. Now, Ridge Vineyards was acquired by the Otsuka Pharmaceutical Company, a Japanese company who purchased them through their US subsidiary. At the time, the pharmaceutical company's chairman, Akihiko Otsuka, was a wine fanatic, and the story goes that Paul Draper managed to convince him to buy the winery as a result of a blind tasting where he served him Mouton Rothschild 1970 alongside Ridge Montebello 1970. The chairman was so impressed that he bought the company. Today, Ridge Vineyards operates as a profitable, wholly independent subsidiary with almost no interference from the parent company. Evidently, the understanding exists that they must make good wine and not lose money. Now, Zinfandel, the principal variety in this wine, it is a variety that California has very much made its own. Today, we do actually know through genetic testing that it is the same as Southern Italy's Primitivo and also Croatia's Tribidrag. It's fair to say that Lytton Springs is one of Zinfandel's classic expressions. However, as I've already said, this is actually a field blend. So along with the Zinfandel, in places interplanted and often co-fermented, there was also Petite Syrah, or de Riff as you'd call it if you were Australian, Carignan, Mataro, or again, as it's better known, Mouvedre, going into this blend. I understand there is some Grenache in this vineyard as well, but in 2014 that's not recorded as going into this blend. So these are varieties you would find in Mediterranean climates, growing throughout southern France and also in parts of southern Spain. The Lytton Springs vineyard is in the Dry Creek Valley, which is in Sonoma County, so we're north of the bay and close to Healdsburg. The vineyard boasts diverse, well-drained soils, and these are a mixture of types such as gravelly clay loam and loamy clay. They all tend to be rich in minerals from ancient riverbeds, and they promote deep root growth in the old vines on the vineyard. Aspects here also vary. The vineyard covers low rolling hills and benchland between the Alexander Valley and Dry Creek. The climate is a warm, sunny Mediterranean climate that's perfect for Zinfandel. There's a cooling influence of fog from the nearby coast on occasions, and the resulting fruit tends to have a balance between richness and ripeness, but also good acidity. The viticultural approach here is entirely sustainable. In the 2014 vintage, April rains disrupted flowering, and that reduced the size of the crop, but give these dry farmed vines enough water to get through what was the third year of a drought in this region. And in conditions like this, the fact that many of these vines are 90 years old and have a really deep root system really does aid their ability to produce high quality fruit. Mild temperatures at the end of the season in August proved ideal for ripening, helping the retention of both acidity and aromas in the fruit. Harvest went on between the 27th of August and the 18th of September. Everything was hand-picked and everything came just from this one estate. The fruit was destemmed and crushed, and fermentation went on with the ambient yeasts that had found their way into the winery on the fruit. All of the 34 different plots from within the vineyard were vinified separately. Maceration lasted for about 8 days, and specifically the Petite Syrah was whole bunch fermented, just to give it a sort of a softer aspect and to allow the fruit aromas to better express themselves. Maceration was followed by full malolactic conversion. Again, this was conducted with the naturally occurring bacteria being allowed to take full control of that. And as part of their approach, intervening as little as possible, they use just what they feel to be the minimum amount of sulfur dioxide. So they do actually give the figures that 35 parts per million were added at crushing and a further 72 parts per million were added throughout the aging process. Of the 34 plots that were harvested from the vineyard, only 25 of those lots actually made their way into the final blend. Final blend is 69% of Zinfandel with 18% of Petite Syrah, 11% of Carignan and 2% of Mataro. Ridge's approach is always to mature their wines in American oak. However, at the same time, they're not looking for sort of quite the strong vanilla flavours that are normally associated with wines such as Australian Shiraz or Rioja that are aged in American oak. So what they do is they have the barrels coopered in the way that French oak would be coopered. So instead of being kiln dried, this is air dried wood. I would assume instead of being cut, the staves are split, and this gives a more gentle oak character to the wine. Now this wine aged for 13 months in 225 litre barriques, so relatively small barrels, and only a small percentage is new, normally sort of 15 to 20%. I believe in 2014, 15% was new, and then there was 15% that had been used for one vintage before, 20% that had been used twice, 20% that had been used 3 times, a further 15% that had seen 4 vintages, and the final 15% that had seen 5 vintages. So although there will be some influence of oak, actually the main point of oak aging here is to try and soften and integrate the tannins through gentle oxidation over that 13 months, giving the wine a little delicate, extra spicy complexity as well. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? I'd say it has a good dark ruby colour. It's reasonably deep, but I can see through it, so there's a medium depth of colour. The wine loses a little bit of colour to the rim, but there's still a sort of a ruby red colour there. It's not yellowing at all. Swelling the wine, it's labelled as having 14.4% alcohol, and that really is sort of forming tears on the side of the glass there very readily. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are rich with some really fascinating primary fruit. What starts as sort of red cherries moves on to things like dried cranberry, glacé cherries, and then opens again to show more of a black cherry note. But there's a sort of a greater depth as well. There are things like black plum, damson, bullis, things like that in there. There are small amounts of nutmeg and cinnamon spices in there, but actually they're incredibly well integrated. They don't stand out individually. They're sort of sitting within rather than outside and framing the fruit. There really is that sort of quite rich, concentrated, ripe note of glacier cherry at the top there. So let's have a taste. The palate is dry, rich, rounded, smooth, opulent. There really is a very appealing, open note of cherries at the front of the mouth. There are notes of ripeness, almost as of a glycerol-like texture to the wine. But following on from that, you do start to see those notes of nutmeg and cinnamon sitting inside the fruit very nicely, leading on to some more sort of savoury, leathery notes on the mid-palate that are sitting alongside some very juicy, opulent, black cherry notes. Perhaps there are some notes of loganberry. There's a concentration and a richness. The wine structure is smooth and rounded, although there is a little bit of sort of perhaps coffee-ish, drying bitterness to the mid-palate. This is a wine I've tasted on video before, probably about 4.5 years ago. Unsurprisingly, the wine is showing more of that savoury character than it did back then. At the same time, every time that I feel the fruit is fading, there's good acidity that comes back and lifts that lovely, juicy, black cherry note and places it back almost centre stage on the palate. The flavours are long, the tannins are not particularly harsh. It's a nicely rounded and fully mature wine. I saw a suggestion that this wine might have a drinking window out to 2034. However, Ridge Vineyards website suggests that actually its ideal life expectancy was about 10 years. So I've slightly exceeded that. And I think possibly that's probably about right. While the wine is lovely now, I think it's starting to lose its opulent primary fruit. And I don't think the more savoury, developed tertiary fruit that's following has quite the same excitement. Personally, I think this is a wine that needs drinking up. It's not completely past it. I will very much enjoy drinking it up. Looking at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score, that gave this a mark of 91 out of 100. It may be being a little tough on it, but given the fact that I think it's coming towards the end of its life, I think that's probably fair to the wine now. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. I'd really appreciate that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. If you're watching these videos and enjoying them, could I ask, could you consider please subscribing to my YouTube channel? That would really help me to develop it further. And if you have any comments about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else related to this, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the tastings I'm doing. Now, I'll leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so that you can go to that and you can see if it's available in your market or what other vintages might be available and at what price. And actually, if you look at some of the other tabs that are attached to that page, there's an awful lot of background information for this wine. It's a fantastic resource and well worth looking at. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll make some time in the very near future and come and join me for another video tasting. Till then, bye for now.